Good morning and welcome to part 2 of my 2K walk. In the first episode we had a walk through the woodland which is in the far distance behind me, and we had a look at the plant life and animal life that occurs there, and I encouraged everybody to pay close attention to the ground around them and the hedgerows and the trees, and it's amazing what you find. Today I'm speaking to you from a garden which I've been working on with a friend of mine for the last few years, just outside the town of Ballahadreen. And I want to go through every single aspect of the garden. In other words, what we did and why we did it, why we planted certain plants in certain places. And also we'll have a look at the insect life and the animal life which occurs when you start to build a garden. Because when you build a garden, you're creating an environment for other species to live in. So come along and we'll start below on the lawn, and we'll see how we get on. So I'm down here on the main lawn at the back of the house. Now, a lot of us don't have big spaces to work with or large areas to create a garden, so you have to kind of think of how you're going to work with what you have. When I grew up, we grew up in a council estate in Clane in County Kildare, and the gardens were quite small, but my mum was a really avid gardener, and her mum was really specialist in roses, and she created a fantastic garden, and that's really where I got the bug, if you like, to get into gardening. And she was very good at using the space that she had to create this fantastic garden. Here it's a different story. There's quite a lot of space, but this is typical of a lot of houses which were built across Ireland. You have a big house and a big lawn, and an awful lot of people just leave it like that. They just have the house, the lawn, maybe a couple of trees, and that's it. And you spend most of the time just mowing it or fertilising it or whatever. And sometimes I try and encourage people to break up a lawn, to try and use some of it for maybe plant some apple trees, like a mini orchard, or even grow veg. And the one thing about this lawn is it looks pretty good, it looks nice and healthy. But would it surprise you if I told you that I've never fertilised this lawn, ever? I've never put one bit of fertiliser on it. And when I mow this lawn, I never put the grass box on it. I always put the grass, back into the lawn, because the clippings will decompose down and actually re-fertilise the lawn itself. And I'm a greenkeeper by trade, so I've built golf courses all around the world, and I worked in the K Club for many years. And with a golf course, you're trying to grow types of grass which don't normally grow in Ireland or even in the west of Ireland. And when people see these fantastic lawns on golf courses or parks, they want to try and emulate that in their own back gardens. But it's nearly impossible, because if you don't have the correct sprays, if you don't have the correct sprays, by the way, this is Finton, or if you don't have the machinery in which to cut the lawns to make it look like that patchwork kind of quilt type effect, you're just going to waste a hell of a lot of money. And you're nearly better off letting nature take its course. When you first establish or seed a lawn, you're just going to grow the seed which was in the bag, which is normally what's called a number 2 mix. But over a period of time, seeds from native grasses will blow in, and they will start to propagate across the lawn, and it's nearly impossible to control it. So you're actually nearly better off just letting the lawn grow the way it grows. The second tip I'd say is, when you're mowing a lawn, always try and mow it in a different direction every time. If you continuously mow the grass in the same direction, the grass eventually starts growing in that direction. And not only that, it'll start to form these ruts in the lawn, and the wheels of the mower will start to bed down into these ruts, and you'll never get rid of them. So it's always best, and it's really good practice, to change the direction of the mowing every time you do it. And this lawn, I'm looking down at it, it's full of creeping buttercup, which we saw in the wood behind me, and it's full of clover and dandelions and daisies. And actually over here, I only mowed this lawn yesterday, and the dandelions are coming back up straight away. It's incredible, and we just mowed it 12 hours ago. If you have clover in your lawn, it's always good to leave it there, because clover is one of those family of plants called a legume. I mentioned a vetch in the wood in episode 1, and vetch is one of those families. Clover is a member of that family too. Clover is really important because it can fix nitrogen. In other words, it can take nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil through a process with bacteria in their root system. And it's a really good natural way of getting nitrogen into the soil rather than going out and buying bags of fertilizer. You may have plenty of moss in the lawn. If the moss is really, really bad, it's better to spike it or aerate the soil in the worst areas, because when you do that, as I said before in episode 1, you're changing the soil conditions in which the moss grows. And when you aerate the soil, the moss just can't grow there anymore, and eventually it'll disappear. It's better to do that than pump tons of sulfate of iron into the lawn in order to kill the moss. Because remember, the moss is really a symptom of another problem, and the main problem is no air in the soil, or compaction. And a lot of lawns, when they were laid, over the last few years, they were rolled, which is a really bad idea. Because when you roll the lawn after you seed it, or just before you seed it, you're pushing or squashing the soil down, and therefore air can't get into the soil, and the lawn actually takes a long time to establish. So, in my opinion, look at it. It looks fantastic. It looks really lush. It's growing away fine, but it's no way a perfect lawn. So I wouldn't get too caught up about having the lawn looking as perfect as possible. It's fine if you had just a small few square meters or few square feet in front of a housing estate or a garden, but I wouldn't get too caught up in it. The main thing is to keep it cut regularly and don't spray it. Just allow nature to take its course. And you'll find that a lot of insects will flourish. Any wildflowers that are growing in the peripheries will invite in some pollinating insects, and they in turn will go and pollinate any fruit trees or even vegetables that you have in the garden. I think it's a good idea to bring you around and introduce you to some of the plants which are growing in this particular garden. And beside me are two really nice examples. The yellow one, which you may recognise, is Cytisus scoparius. And now I'm going to mention a lot of botanical names during this episode, and I'll try and explain what they mean. When you go to a garden centre, whenever they open again, it's always a good idea when you pick up the plants or look at the plants to look at the label, because the label tends to give away certain attributes of the plants. In this case, scoparius is Latin for broom, and that's where it gets its name from. It's a broom plant, and I suppose people used to, take the long strands when the flowering heads are gone off them and use them as brooms. But it's also a medicinal plant. The dried tops of the branches were used as a diuretic. So it's an interesting plant. This time of the year, again, it's a yellow flower, and it's absolutely full of insects at the moment. I'll give you a close-up shot in a second. But we have bumblebees and native bees and plenty of flies, and again those black gnats which we saw down in the rush bed in episode 1. And beside me we have a gunnera. Some people call it wild rhubarb. And neither of these plants are native to Ireland, and in fact this one, a lot of people deem this one to be an invasive species. In between 1810 and 1830, an awful lot of Victorians were bringing back plants to the UK and to Ireland and using them in their gardens. So they were bringing them from all over the world, and they were planting them in their garden. Gunnera is one of these. This was first planted in Achill in County Mayo, and then just spread everywhere, and you can see it from here all the way down to Kerry. And it was deemed to be a really nice ornamental plant, and even Darwin himself called it an extraordinary plant. And the same with the Cytisus. It's really a native of Australia and New Zealand, and in fact an awful lot of ornamental plants which are grown in gardens in Ireland come from the southern hemisphere. Just spotted one of the great enemies of every gardener, and that's a slug. And he's currently travelling at 0.0001 miles an hour in the direction of the vegetable garden behind me. And if he's quick enough, he'll get there by dinner time. There are two types of slugs in a garden. There are, of course, the herbivores, which munch everything they can get at, your lettuce and your pak choi and all your salad leaf. And then you have your carnivores, which are the guys with the tiger stripes, and they're the fellows that you'd see the trails on your cat food if you leave it out at night. They go up and munch it at night time. The carnivores go along and eat the eggs of the herbivores. So the carnivores are the good guys, and these guys are the bad fellas. Now, there is and was a thing of putting out slug pellets to kill slugs. We don't use any chemicals in this garden whatsoever. And the problem with the chemicals, ordinary slug pellets, is that it contains a chemical which affects not just the slugs, but everything that has a symbiotic relationship with the slugs. So in other words, the slug will ingest the chemical, and then the birds will come along and eat the slug, and then the bird dies. Really, the best way to deal with slugs is to try and introduce a surface that they don't like to travel across. So any kind of a gritty surface. You can use beer traps if you like. You can, fill a jar or put on a plate some beer, and the slugs will go in and basically drown in it. You can use salt, but that's a whole other conversation. Or you can use straw or wood chippings around the veg itself, which is what we've done as an experiment in some of the vegetables behind me. And we found that the damage this year, as opposed to other years, is very minimal. And I have a funny feeling it's the straw chips that we put around the veg. Coffee grounds is another really good thing to put around your vegetables. They just don't like travelling across that surface because the particles sticks to them, and they find it impossible to get rid of it. But I'll leave him on his way. There's plenty of food there for him. So I've stopped here because it's a really good example of what you can do if you have a space in the garden and you're not quite sure what to do with it. So imagine there's no plants here and it's just a blank canvas, bit of grass out the front or the back of your house. And what I did here was, well, first of all, my friend planted all these trees and they're dotted all over the lawn. It's a bit of a challenge to mow, but it's really, really nice, especially this time of the year. We have a flowering cherry here on my right hand side. We have one of my favourite trees, which is the Sorbus luteens, or white beam, really, really nice tree. And then on the left, I just got a spade one day and dug out this, so marked it out with a bit of hose, and then went along with the spade, and then started planting and dotting plants up and down, left, right and centre. So basically I popped in a bunch of daffodil bulbs, and you can see them all here. They're just finished flowering. One thing about daffodils is, although they look unsightly when they finish flowering, don't be tempted to cut them down, because if you cut them, you're stopping all that energy that's in the upper part of the plant to go back down into the bulb, so that they have that energy to come back up next year. So leave them be. If you think they look a bit unsightly, you can bend them over and tie them up until they've completely died back down into the ground. And then there are some perennials here like lupins, and we have aquavigia, and we have some phlox coming up. We have some poppies or papaver coming up here. I popped in an ilex golden king, which is a holly. We have a Photinia red robin. So there's really no rhyme or reason, but I try to put in plants that will have some sort of interest, throughout the year. So the Photinia red robin is evergreen, and so is the holly. And then we have, of course, Finton the cat, who wants to get in on the action again. And actually Finton is quite interested in a plant up here, which I'll show you in a few minutes, called Catnip or Nepeta. And they tend to like those plants. But again, it's just a case of marking it out, dotting in a few plants. For the first couple of years, it'll look pretty bad, because some plants, it takes about 2 to 3 or even 4 years for them to establish. But once things get going, well then, the fruit of your labours is pretty visible. So yeah, that's about it. It's just an idea. And the other thing as well is with perennials, as they get bigger, you can get a spade and divide them or cut them in two and then use them somewhere else in the garden. So you're always kind of reusing or repropagating plants. this holly plant which I mentioned earlier on, and it's quite interesting. It's Ilex Golden King, and it has a relative called Ilex Silver Queen. Now, when they were naming these plants back in the late 1700s, they actually made a mistake. With holly, you have a male and a female. So they presumed or thought that this was the male, so it's Golden King, and that the relative was the female, Silver Queen. But in actual fact, this is the female, and the silver one is the male. But they never changed it around. So even though it's called Golden King, it's actually the female. Interesting. This is a plant I think everybody should have in their garden, no matter how small or big or whatever. The common name is Catnip and the botanical name is Nepeta, and cats absolutely love it. Right on cue, Finton. When you buy a cat toy or any kind of a plaything for your cats, they're always stuffed with this plant because it's almost like, I suppose, a drug to cats. They absolutely love it, and sometimes the cats around here will come here and roll in it or eat it or bite it, and their levels of excitement go up to about 11 after doing so. A fantastic plant, and when it flowers, it has these really, really nice purple flowers that almost looks like lavender, and the bees absolutely love it. So this is just about to flower. I can see all the small flower heads. I'll bring the camera in a few minutes time for you to have a look at it. But yeah, it's a really nice plant. It's easy to propagate as well. So this one was planted about 1.5 years ago, and you can see how big it's after getting. It was only planted as a small plant, a bit like this rosemary here beside it. But you can cut it in half and then plant it elsewhere, or even in pots. It's really, really good in pots. One to look out for. I'm down here at what I consider to be the heart of the garden, which is the vegetable patch. Now, these steps that I'm standing on are a new addition, and I built them about 3 weeks ago. I just spent a day building them, because before that, if anybody wanted to walk from the house down to the vegetable patch, you got your feet wet, especially if it was raining. So I got some decking boards and old bits of planks and built each one into a frame, leveled it with a level, and then backfilled it with some soil and gravel, put some weed membrane or hypex on top of it, and then just finished it off with stone. And it completely changed the aspect of the vegetable garden from the point of view of the house behind. And it's one of the examples of any small thing that you do to a garden will enhance it in every way. And that's why gardening is so enjoyable, because it's very visible, any of the work that you do. And this wasn't very difficult to do. The bits of decking and planks were lying around. You could do it yourself with any bits of material. If you want to put in a path and it's on level ground, well then it's simply a case of just digging it out and then putting down your hypex and then your stone or gravel or whatever, or even bark or whatever you want to do. But again, it's a really simple idea. It just took me a day to do it, and it has really enhanced the whole area. And when I finished this, I ended up continuing along and put in a path just the far side of the glass house. So the whole area is almost like a self-contained microcosm. So, welcome to the Veg Garden. In front of me are a few pots, and are a really good idea for anybody who doesn't have the space to grow crops or vegetables or anything like that. Just get some old containers, buckets, Wellington boots, old toilets, whatever, it doesn't matter as long as there's good drainage. And you can plant basically anything in pots, from potatoes, cabbage, lettuce. In this case we have alpine strawberries, just ordinary strawberries, and then we have some nasturtium as well. Strawberries do particularly well in the west of Ireland. They're in flower at the moment, and there's plenty of insects flying around pollinating them. And the nasturtium, these were planted from seed about maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they're coming on really, really well. It's been very dry here over the last few weeks, and we've had to come out and water the plants every night. We've had plenty of failures, and I'll show you some of those, and it's all learning by, I suppose, experimentation. But nasturtium are normally grown as an ornamental plant, so you'll have plenty of yellow and orange and red and white blooms on these later on. However, they have another use, and that is a great addition to any salad. If you pick the leaves, especially at this stage, and pop them into a salad, they have this fantastic peppery taste. You can eat the flowers. It's really, really nice. So when they're in flower, and you're making a summer salad, you can pick the flowers and dot them through the salad and then put the leaves through as well. Really nice taste. It's getting near lunchtime now and I'm getting kind of hungry. But highly recommend it, really easy to grow. I have some growing in pots outside the front of the gate as well. And these are hanging pots, so I know that eventually when they're in the search and flower, they'll all fall over the pots and hang down onto the ground. And it'll be just almost like a waterfall of colour. Really easy to do. All you need is a bit of compost. However, I will give one warning. If you're using pots from last year, try and empty out the soil and put in new soil or new compost. Because pots which are overwintered tend to harbour a creature called a vine weevil. Now, vine weevil is a little beetle that lays eggs in pots and containers, and then the larvae, which are small little white, almost like a maggot, eat the roots of all the plants that are in the pots. So something to watch out for. If I spot one around here later on, I'll take some footage of it and show you what it looks like. But always try and remove the old soil and old compost and introduce some new soil and new compost. And then you have a clean slate to start with. In the west of Ireland we have very, very wet winters. It can be quite cold. We get some bracing winds from the northwest and the west. So it's a good idea, if you can, to make some kind of covering, like a polytunnel or a glass house or a grow house, or you can make your own out of a bit of wood and polythene or whatever. And it gives you a chance to grow things that you might not normally grow. This was basically cobbled together with a frame, an old frame that we got, and then we got some polythene and polystyrene and bits of cardboard, and we kind of mashed it all together, and it has proved really, really useful. I start all my seedlings in there. We're growing basil in there. We even have a grape plant growing in there, which is fantastic. I've got an artichoke, fantastic artichoke here, and I built it because the garden is on the slope. I had to dig into the hillside and sat it up on these 4-inch solid blocks, which allowed me to bring in soil into the glasshouse and build it up a small bit, so that at least there'll be a bit of depth to the soil. You could technically put it straight down into the soil, but it's more of a solid structure here. It gets quite windy here in the winter time, and actually last winter we lost all the glass off it, and I had to go around the garden picking up bits of glass and trying to put the whole thing back together like a jigsaw basically. So it's very, very useful. Later on we'll have tomato plants in there, we'll have some dwarf beans, courgettes, sweet corn, you know, so there'll be a huge amount of plants in here later on. And like everything in the veg garden, we try and rotate the crops, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, so that we're not planting the same crops in the same place every year. So really useful, easy to put together. If you have a bit of, you know, old wood, you can make your own onto the side of a house or a lean-to or whatever. And it's orientated so that the long side of it is, you know, facing the south, which gets the most sun. I put the door towards the east because the prevailing winds always come from the west. If I had put the door on the far side, every time you'd open the door in a windy day, the wind would just blow through the glasshouse. And then we just open the doors and the vents on really warm days, just to allow some of the heat to escape, because plants don't like it too hot. So just an idea, something to bear in mind if you're thinking about putting one together. I'd highly recommend it. And I've explained the method to the madness. So initially this was just a blank bit of lawn or grass, and the first thing we did was dig up the area with a spade. So it's basically, you need to get out, get a spade, and I tried to do it, we did it, I think it was October time, and dug it over twice, so almost like double digging. So dug it over, forked it in, and then we got some farmyard manure from a farm up the road and just dug it into it. And then I left it over winter, and then we had some hard frost that winter, and the frost had to break up the clods, I should say. And then we covered it over with some black polythene. Now the black polythene did two things. Number one, it heated up the soil over winter, so it kept it nice and warm. And secondly, it killed all the weeds which were underneath, which would have grown if we hadn't put the polythene down. So it meant that when we took off the polythene to plant in, say, March, April, May, the soil was warmer than the rest of the soil around it, which wasn't covered up, and all the weeds were dead, so all we had to do was just dig it up. Now, I've been practicing a thing called the no-dig method, where we just basically plant into the soil and don't dig it over, and it's a really easy way to do it. All you do is keep introducing like composts or organic matter or farmyard manure, or we have a compost heap down the back there, and keep building it up without having to dig the soil whatsoever. And it means that you're not disturbing any of the microbes within the soil. Now, don't get me wrong, you could actually go ahead and just dig it as normal. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a good way to get started. And secondly, the first year we didn't plant anything from seeds. We actually got the small plants, or the seedlings themselves, which already had a bit of a start, and used those to plant. In this case, we have some cauliflower and cabbage, and I have some kale. I've got some peas growing here, more peas there, and behind we have some potatoes. Now last year it was swapped, so we had our peas and beans down there and our cabbage, and we had all our potatoes up here. So vegetables are divided into, I suppose, four main categories. You have your root crops, which are, you know, your potatoes, carrots, parsnips. You have what's called your brassicas, which are your leafy veg, and they're your cabbage, cauliflower, lettuce, anything of which you eat the leaves. Then you have your legumes, or like the vetches that we saw earlier on, or the clover. They're all in the same family, so legumes, and they're your peas and beans, and they're the guys that fix nitrogen or take nitrogen from the soil and pop it into the ground. And then you have your others, which are garlic, onions, things like that. So essentially, in my mind, the garden is divided up into four parts, and what we do every year is we just keep rotating where we've planted those vegetables. Now, I mentioned slugs earlier on and the straw chippings, and you can see here that we've put the straw chippings around the cabbage and cauliflower, and just looking around here, there's actually very little damage from slugs, even though if you come out here at night time with a torch, you'd be amazed the amount of slugs, and it's something you should do at home. Even if you don't have a veg garden, just go out at night with a torch and have a look and see how many, and you're talking thousands of slugs that come out to try and munch whatever vegetation is growing around. And yeah, everything is doing really well. Again, we've just used a bit of chicken pellets, chicken manure, farmyard manure dug into it earlier on. We do keep it well weeded, so we use a hoe on a dry day and we pick the weeds on a wet day, and that's important because you don't want any of the weeds to compete with the food crop. And even looking around here, I can see some potato seedlings from bits of potatoes which would have been in here last year, but they're poking up through the soil, so they'll have to be picked, otherwise we're going to have, you know, spuds mixed in with cabbage. And that's it. I mean, we basically pop them in, see how they grow. I mean, some people would argue that the kale is too close together, there's some gaps missing in it, you know, bits and pieces like that. Cabbages are too close together, but that's not the point. The point is to get the plants, pop them into the soil, and just give it a go, see what happens. And your kids would be amazed with this, because kids are fascinated by growth and getting their hands dirty, and you know, the transformation that happens when you begin to garden. And it's a really good way of getting a small area within your garden and get your kids to dig it up. Beans and peas are a really good way to start with kids, because they're up in a matter of between 5 and 10 days. The seedlings are up, and they're amazed at how quickly a plant can appear from a dormant seed, which I mentioned over in the woodland in episode 1. You can see behind me our potatoes are coming up. We planted first earlies, second earlies and main crops. So they're the three, I suppose, categories of potatoes. First earlies, as the name suggests, are the ones that you plant first, and they're the ones that crop first. Second earlies are slightly later, and then your main crops are, you know, the main bulk of the crop. We've got mostly British Queens, Records, Roosters, and then there is a blight-resistant potato called Sapramira, so we've planted those as well. Last year we planted those blight-resistant spuds, and it was fantastic because all the other ones got gradual kind of variations of blight, but the Sapramira weren't touched at all. I mean, they were as healthy as the day they were planted, basically, when it came to cropping. And then over on my left, which I'll show you a bit closer, I have a little experiment where I have a cloche, which is basically a covering, and I'm just trying to see how growth differs between, you know, growing them out in the open like this or growing them under some polythene. And then we have the supports for the beans and peas. These are just simple supports, and I've planted the beans and peas around it, and they'll eventually make their way all the way up the structure itself. They're just bits of branches of ash and hazel that I picked out of the wood and stuck them in the ground. And then I have some onions and shallots growing here, and some more onions in that section there. And that's about it. It's only a matter of, you know, making sure to get plenty of water. So we come out here at night time and give them a water. I have a little sprinkler that I connect onto a hose, and we just let it run for, you know, half an hour or even an hour. And keeping the weeds down is the other thing, and that's about it. When the nasturtiums and the other flowering plants that we have planted in seeds, we're going to plant those out here. When they're in flower, they'll invite or attract more pollinating insects, which will help in the pollination of any of the plants that we have planted around here. So I'll give you a closer look at everything. We're even starting to use some of these already. So we've been using kale for the dinner, even though they're not quite mature. And you can see actually the peas and the beans are starting to produce their tendrils, which are like basically tentacles, if you like, and they're pulling themselves up the wire, which you have on both sections here. And that's how peas get a grip or get a foothold. So they use these tentacles to pull themselves all the way up, and then they'll start flowering, and of course the bees and the pollinating insects will come along and pollinate them, and then we'll have our crop later on in the season. So that's it for part 2. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have any questions about any of the things we've discussed in either part 1 or part 2, please leave a comment below and I'll be more than happy to get back to you. I'm just going to start filming some insects and some animal life, which is all around me today, and if you have any indication of what they are, if you're able to identify them, please leave a comment below. It'll be quite interesting to see how many of these you're able to identify. In part 3, I'll be setting up some infrared cameras both here in the garden and in the woodland below, and I'll be able to give you an indication of how alive both the garden and the wood becomes at night when everybody's in bed. It's quite fascinating. We'll be able to see foxes, badgers, hedgehogs, and even pine martens. So until then, stay safe, be mindful, be nice to each other, and try and get out and garden. Goodbye.